Now this is going to be quite a long one because I want to combine the time editor with the graph editor. Now the graph editor has a lot of things that I think it deserves a separate sort of tutorial, so I'm just going to go through them a little bit quick just to make sure that I don't overload you with a lot of stuff. So I'm going to go through the time editor and then the graph editor. Now let me start with creating a rectangle shape. I just want to set some keyframes because they're going to really help us as we're going through some of these sort of options as we're dealing with a time editor. So I'm going to set some keyframes, but before I set, I'm just going to move the shape a little bit on the left. And I'm just going to create some sort of keyframes on the x-axis. I'm just going to drag it like 30 frames or 31, probably 30. And I'm just going to drag it on the right. And I'm just going to get the 60 frame mark and copy, Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, and copy the keyframe. So I'm just going to limit the playhead area to this sort of a section, 60 frames per second, but I just want also to maintain these sort of frames. Now, you can actually switch between, for those of you who don't prefer frames, used to time, you can just click here and then change it from frames to actually time, which is actually kind of nice. So we are apparently 2 seconds and, 2 seconds, and 20 milliseconds probably. All right, so I'm just going to play it back. As you can see, nothing fancy, just the shape moving from left to right, which is actually kind of nice. Right, so I'm just going to duplicate this shape, right? And now, unlike After Effects, I can actually drag this around, and the sort of animation won't be actually broken, which is actually very nice. In After Effects, you have to use a now layer. You have to drag the now layer instead of the shape, otherwise, the animation will be broken. So I'm just going to come and switch this to this sort of a cogwheel, right? So that we have something a bit different, and I'm also going to give it a different color, that sort of a color. And this one, I think it also deserves a different color. I don't really like that green, neither that yellow, so let me just give it that sort of a color. All right, that's kind of nice. And I'm just going to add in some other shape, a star. Now this one is not going to be animated. But then what I did with this other one, I just literally switched the primitive type, right? So you can switch a primitive type and then it maintains the animation, which is actually very, very nice. So I've added a star shape just there and without keyframes intentionally because I want us to see something, right? So I'm just going to start going through the sort of thing in here within the time editor. I'm actually going to separate this into 2 videos so that it's not too long, right? All right, so apparently, let me just name this layer Zozo, whatever they call it. I don't know how to pronounce this, but I think it's some sort of a game or something like that. So once we enter, for example, let me say we have like 100 layers. You can actually search for a layer. So that particular layer that I've typed out, right? Zozo, right? I've actually typed it just to, I know you guys will correct me whether the pronunciation is actually right. So you can actually search out in layer, right? If I select star or something like that, then the layer name actually just appears, which is actually a very nice way of actually filtering out. Then here we can actually add these sort of properties and shapes and behaviors, right? So I can just search out for any sort of maybe behavior, let me say duplicator or something like that, and then I just click on it and you can, add it. So there are shapes, I can actually add a shape, a basic shape or something like that, a behavior, utilities, and effects. Some of them are pro, some of them are literally free. So you can actually add them there. But as I told you guys, you can also use this sort of a panel. The panel actually also exists just up here. So you can use whatever actually is easy for you. Or there's also a shortcut, which is Command or Control period. And, it brings up the panel and you can click away. Or if you want to actually have it, floating, you can actually have it floating by just clicking on that button. So let me close it. I just want to go back to the colors. All right, so that's it with this option. Then here, actually, just like in After Effects, you can enable motion blur, which is actually very nice. So there are some motion blur settings that you can actually set within the composition, right? You can set the motion blur settings in here by just enabling it here, which is actually very nice. And here it's literally for presets. I'll talk about presets and how they work or stuff like that. You can save presets. So I'll talk about that in a separate video, but this is how actually where you set them from. And here we have the composition settings. The shortcut is Ctrl-K for you to actually change the composition settings. I talked about it in some other videos, so I won't go through it again. Yeah, but you can change the composition settings and set them. Now, if you're coming from After Effects, most of them are, kind of familiar, the width and height, the frame range, playback range, all this sort of stuff, which is okay, very nice. All right. The next one, I've already talked about it. You can change, from frames to time, and it just shows you where the sort of time mark area is, which is actually very, very nice. All right. This is actually the playhead. So where the playhead is, it shows where that frame is, right? Well, the number of frames which are there, or the number of frames to that sort of a playhead where it actually is. All right. So the next one, we've actually talked about all this up. Here you can actually lock a layer. So I can actually lock this sort of a star shape, and I can drag it within the UI, which is actually sometimes very, very helpful. Then I can actually enable the visibility on and off. As I told you guys in some other video, you can also disable the visibility from this sort of a panel. As you can see, once I click on it, it actually becomes invisible and visible, which is actually very nice. Here I can actually turn a layer to a 3D. So apparently this layer is actually a 3D because I've turned it to 3D, right? Which is actually very nice. I'm actually on this particular layer. All right. So here you can actually change the colors, which is actually very nice to actually have a bit of organization. And the color changes also work with tags. Now I'll create a separate video talking about tags and how they work. But think of them as something that does filtering. Now I've talked about them because I was going to actually talk about them in this particular sort of section. So here you can actually assign tags. So I'll talk about what tags are. So you can just, for example, we have one of the tags. Actually created, a video concerning tags. Apparently it's literally a long one, but you can assign a tag and you can just name it anything, and it will create a new sort of thing in here, and you use it to actually create filters and stuff like that. So I'll talk about that in a separate video. Then here we have this sort of a drop down, so you can actually show the properties all disable them or something like that. So that's what it does. Then here you can actually still like showing the properties or disabling them. It actually does the same thing. This is actually more of hierarchy. And the next sort of a tool in here, actually this is more of the keyframe. As you can see, it's actually we're animating the exposition, so it shows it here, right? And then this is the keyframe sort of a thing where you can actually add a keyframe, and then you can see here whether it's actually, this is for seeing a connection, just in case we have a connection in the x-axis. It will either show purple or yellow, to show the layer that's driving and the layer that's being driven. So that's it with this sort of icons that you see within the timeline. All right. So down here, as I said, it's actually the tag. It's actually called a tag drawer. So you can open it and close it. We should talk about that in a separate video. Then here, it's actually, there's a shortcut to this, which is actually U. Just like in After Effects, you can enable only the layers with the keyframes, or actually disable the layers with the keyframes, which is actually sometimes helpful. So the shortcut is actually U, just like in After Effects. And down here, we have something which I want to talk about. Okay, let me go into this sort of a thing. As you can see, we have a timeline here. If we want to drag the layers with the keyframes, right? For example, once I click on this layer and I want to drag it with the keyframes, I just click on it and then drag it with its own keyframes. I can actually drag a bunch of layers by pressing Shift and drag them all together, which is actually very, very nice. Let me press Shift and I can drag them all together, which is actually very nice. I can actually select them all together, right? And then drag them around. All right. But if I want to actually just drag the layer without the keyframe, I can actually just hover here. As you can see, it shows a little bit of lighting at its end or at its tip, right? And I can actually drag it around and the keyframes won't actually move with it, which is actually very nice. But there's also an option once you press Option all out, if somebody's using Windows, you can actually drag them all together at once, which is actually very, very nice, right? So that's basically to do with that. But let me show you something. There are some things which I want to show us. There are also some other things with the keyframes that I'm going to show you. Actually, let me show you a few things to do with the keyframes. So let me drag this layer back. If I want to move the keyframes alone, right, I just have to highlight them, right? Once I highlight them, I can actually move them around, which is actually very nice. But I have to make sure that this sort of transform tool is actually enabled. Once I have it disabled, right, and I click onto them and I try moving them around, obviously they can't move. But if you have it disabled and you want to only move these sort of two layers, it's actually very hard to move only two, in fact, not two layers, two keyframes. As you can see, once I highlight them, once I click here, the keyframes can't move. I can only move the keyframe one by one. But when I have it enabled, right, and select only these two keyframes, I can actually move them around. Whatever sort of keyframes that I've selected. I can also just select these ones and I can move them all together at once, which is actually very nice. So that's the essence of having this enabled, the transform tool, right? And the next one, what haven't I talked about? Okay, the next one is actually the align tool. So these options down here, I can switch from a graph editor, from a time editor to a graph editor. I'm going to talk about the graph editor in the next sort of video. I wanted to separate them, or I can actually just make it one long video, just like I mentioned earlier. So apparently I'm still with the time editor. These ones I'm going to be using them quite a lot, right? Then this one shows you the frames where the key actually is. So it's at times helpful. More so if at all you are really working with the graph editor. Then we have this sort of align tools or align icons. Now they just work more like this sort of align sort of a thingy, but for keyframes, right? For example, if I select these two keyframes and I want to align them on the left, it's going to drag this keyframe onto this left side. So I can click on it and it aligns it on the left. After Effects actually doesn't have that, which is weird, right? So I can align them in the center, which center is actually, I think, at the 10th mark or something like that. So as you can see, they are aligned in the center, and I can also align them on the left. So it should drag this sort of a keyframe on the left without necessarily moving the layer, which is actually very nice. I've already talked about this. It's actually the transform tool, which I really recommend that you keep enabled. All right. So then we have this sort of viewport snapping. So I always encourage that you keep it enabled because you want, and there are lots of options here to actually enable or rather customize your snapping. So I keep it at 10 frames, which at 10 in terms of the snapping threshold. So you can actually unclick or click the stuff you want to snap to. So the keyframes, the clips, the time markers, so I just keep it enabled, but you can also keep, disable it if you want. Then we have the pacemaker. Once I enable it, this one, just in case you want to create a bit of pacing and stuff like that, it's in two ways. Either it can be in terms of seconds or in terms of bits per minute, just in case you want to customize it, right? Just in case, let me say I want to press an audio here or something like that, or want to create a bit of bits, I can actually increase them. As you can see, they're actually increasing. They're more like guides. You can think of them as guides. They don't affect anything within the timeline or something like that. And you can actually offset them, right? And just increase bits per bar and stuff like that. So yeah, that's what the bit maker basically is for. And just disable it because I'm not going to use it. Here you can actually zoom out and zoom in. Just in case you've over zoomed out, there's actually a shortcut to that. I can just press F and it actually zooms it out to the center, which is very, very nice. Or I can just, if somebody's using a mouse like I am apparently, you can just press out and zoom in and out, just like how Premiere Pro basically does it. So once we switch to the graph editor, right, apparently you can't see anything, right, because I'm not having any layer selected. But once I select a layer, we can see the sort of graph in here, and I can zoom out by just scrubbing through with my sort of cursor, right? Which is actually very, very nice. So still, once you click on a frame, as you can see, there are places where you can see where the keyframe is. Then we have, since we're animating the, the velocity or the position or something like that, it will show you where that particular value is, right? So it's actually negative 518. This particular one is at frame 33. Apparently it's actually frame 33 here, and then at 533. So you can actually copy these and paste them. We should talk about that probably in some video where we shall need to apply that. Same thing, for example, when I have this transform tool enabled, I can actually move the markers or the sort of keyframes all together, which I shall show to us once we have curves enabled, which is actually very nice. So I can still select them, and you can see that sort of a bar which is enabled by this transform tool, once we enable it, which is actually very nice. Then down here we have the grid settings, where you can actually set the grids and increase them or reduce them. So I want to keep them by a default. You may not want to be actually changing them or something like that. The snapping threshold is also there at 10. Then we have ghosting. I'm going to show us what ghosting is in a second. Then we have this sort of a thing. Apparently you can see the position is actually at X because I have enabled that sort of a text. So once I disable it, you see it disappearing. This, I've already talked about it, the pacemaker. Once I enable it, it still shows that. Then we have something which is actually very, very beautiful. We can enable loops. Now, there are two ways of enabling loops, apparently. There are also some other options. Once I click on the keyframes and left click, there are also some other loopings in here, which I think we should talk about in a separate video or something like that. But I can enable looping for these particular keyframes. So I can click here and then they basically loop, right? But you're not going to be able to see the loops until I have deleted one of the keyframes. Apparently it loops, but you won't be able to see maybe them within the timeline. But let me just delete this sort of a keyframe since it's already looping. And once I delete the keyframe, as you can see, let me just maybe disable that loop, right? So as you can see, it has this sort of a continuous sort of thing. Let me actually just expand the timeline here, right? As you can see, it it's not really looping, right? Because I've disabled it. But once I loop these particular keyframes with this sort of a looping, as you can see, it's going to actually just loop back and forth, right? As you can see, it's actually now actually there are two ways. I'm sorry, it wasn't necessarily looping back and forth. It's more of a continuous one. This is the one which actually loops back and forth. So once I click on it, once I click on space, as you can see, let me just disable this. It confuses me. As you can see, it actually goes in that sort of, actually this is more looping back and forth, right? Then there's another one which actually just makes a continuous sort of a loop. So once I click on it and click here, you're going to see that it's just going to continue, right? And it will go off the grid. So this is more of the continuous one. Once you click here and then here, it actually loops back and forth. Yeah, so those are the two kinds of looping, which is actually very, very nice for you to know. Then we have the interpolation, right? With the interpolation, once I click onto it, now let me just maybe enable a Bezier, right? Before, this is actually the Bezier sort of curving. This is more of the interpolation, right? All right. So once I enable the, convert this to a Bezier, so the best way of seeing them, let me just maybe press F to actually zoom to this sort of a section. Let me just zoom this out, right? As you can see, once I clicked on the Bezier, right, I can actually just click on this and probably take them back, right, to this linear sort of a thing. Once I click on a Bezier, it turns into a Bezier path whose handles I can actually, drag around, right, which is actually very, very nice. As you can see, once I'm dragging the upper Bezier, even the one down is actually being transformed, which is actually very nice to actually have that sort of ability. But I can actually disable that sort of ability momentarily. Now I'm going to talk about that when I talk about these sort of connections. Apparently, when I select both the keyframes, right, and here it actually shows unlock Bezier handles. Apparently, they are locked together, right, or they are literally locked together. I think that's the best language I can use apparently. Then I can just click here to unlock them. Once I unlock them and transform again, as you can see, the one down is not actually being moved as I'm moving the one up, which is actually very nice to have that sort of a control. And if I want to lock them again, I can just come here and I click on lock Bezier handle. So they are, once I click on it, they are locked together. And once I come back to actually make the transformations, as you can see, they are transforming up and down, which is actually very nice. The same sort of functions that I've already talked about, the aligning, it's actually down here. So you can align the keyframes on the left, right, and center, which is actually very nice. Let me probably show us a few things here and there. First of all, you can also copy the keyframe. So let me go back to the 60 sort of a keyframe and copy this particular keyframe. And I'm just going to copy the keyframe by pressing Ctrl C. And I'm just going to paste it in this sort of a place. Apparently it's copying the layer, which is actually very weird. So I'm going to come to this sort of a place and I'm just going to copy the keyframe and I'm just going to come here and paste the keyframe, which is actually very, very nice, right? So yeah, I guess you have to click on that particular keyframe and copy and paste it. So here down here, once I'm moving the layer, apparently if I move the handle, as you can see, it also adjusts the one on the left, right? Which can be sometimes nice. Sometimes you don't want that to happen, so I can click on these ones down here and I can unlock them. Once I unlock them, once I'm moving these other ones on the left, it moves independent on the one on the right, which is actually very nice. If I want to join them again, I can just click on lock the, to lock them, which can actually be very nice. So if I enable the continuous sort of looping, let me just maybe click on this and enable the continuous sort of looping. You're going to see that it actually continues looping in that sort of format, which is actually very, very nice. And also there's something which I want you to see. There's this sort of a ghosting that I said I'm going to talk about. Once I'm moving these sort of layers, right? I mean, Bezier sort of handles. As you can see, there's this sort of a lighting thingy which shows you how the Bezier was actually curved like before. As you can see, there's that sort of a line with a small opacity. If you're seeing where I'm handling down here, right? It shows you how it was before, right? So that's literally the ghosting within the curves, which can actually be very nice to see the preview of how, the transformation was before you actually did it, which is actually very, very nice. Once I release it, it actually disappears. If I don't enable it and I'm transforming, you're going to see that you can't really see it, which can be sometimes handy. So I just want to always keep it enabled, and you can see that sort of a ghosting sort of effect, which is actually very nice. So yeah, that's how the graph editor basically works in a nutshell. I believe I've gone through most of the options that we have in there. And yeah, that's basically it. I will see you guys in the next tutorial. So the video has been really, really long. Yeah, but hope you've learned something. See you in the next video. Stay blessed.